Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by our screen time columnist, Kathryn Reklis. Kathryn recently wrote an article about two films, She Said and Women Talking. We are going to talk about those films and that article. But first, Kathryn, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, John. It's really great to have this conversation with you. So I'm a professor of theology, of modern Protestant theology at Fordham University in New York City, where I teach classes on the history of Christianity, Reformation to the present, with a special focus on the history of Christianity and colonialism in the Atlantic world from the 18th century to the present as well. I also teach classes on digital religion and comparative literature, and I direct our comparative literature program, and sometimes also on classes on film and literature. And I have been a columnist for the Christian Century for 12 years, and the solo screen time columnist since 2017.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad we're getting to chat now, finally, on for our YouTube channel. So this article, which we called "When Women Speak More Than Truth," is about two recent films, both about women speaking up, speaking truth. You start in the article talking about the movie She Said, which tells a true story about women who are telling true stories. Why do you think it's important for movies like this to be made?
So that movie is about the two journalists at the New York Times that broke the Harvey Weinstein case back in 2017, which was when they finally had enough evidence to sort of publish definitive investigative reporting about decades-long patterns of sexual misconduct, abuse, and assault by Harvey Weinstein in Hollywood. And it's really, it reminds me, right? It's in a genre, right? She Said is the kind of like heroic journalism genre, like All the President's Men or Spotlight. It's really reminds me of Spotlight in the style of filmmaking. And I love that genre. I think those are great movies in general, because I think maybe more now than ever in a day where the very nature of whether news is reliable or trustworthy or journalism is a meaningful way to make sense of the world. Right? They are movies about the slow, hard work of compiling an investigative journalism story. And like Spotlight, right, there are really kind of slow movies, right? There's a lot of heroism, but the heroism isn't very full of action, right? People aren't jumping off skyscrapers or literally, rushing into burning buildings, right? They're making phone calls. They're looking at computer screens. They're tracking down sources. And in She Said, very much like Spotlight, a lot of the work is convincing the sources to speak. Right? So this is trying to follow the trails of being told, well, you should talk to so-and-so, all right, this goes deeper than you realize, right? There are more people implicated in this than you realize, and trying to find those people and convince them that it's safe to tell their stories and that their stories will be believed if they're told. And I think very much like Spotlight, which for viewers watching this now who haven't seen Spotlight or don't remember, right? It's the movie about the Boston Post.
The Globe, I think.
The Boston Globe breaking, not the first, but one of the most significant stories about the Catholic sex abuse scandal, and kind of showing how substantial the cover up among officials in the Catholic Church was in that, how extensively that cover up was orchestrated. And in both cases, these are about right, sort of really painful issues of abuse and of power that has been wielded over people to destroy or damage their lives, and who have been discredited or not believed or silenced when they've tried to speak their stories. And so the whole arc of a movie like She Said is, can you convince people that if they say the truth, it will be heard? And I think that in this case, sort of this movie, in this moment of sort of Me Too, and also of a backlash to Me Too, right, of a kind of growing cultural sense of should we really be listening to these women, or are they just whining and complaining, right? That backlash has already begun, and we're just a few years into the reckoning. I think this movie is really trying to show us, right, again, how much work it took, right, and how careful the work was to make this case and to convince people especially these women, to speak.
Yeah, thank you. I saw Spotlight. I loved Spotlight. You're right about the slow pacing. I feel like the most exciting scene in the whole movie, they're like looking at a spreadsheet on
Yes,
their computer screen.
yes, it's the
But
same. So much of that, like just people at keyboards, or this whole thing of like pressing send on like a, like
mhm.
that's the big dramatic moment.
Yeah, but I'm really excited to see She Said. So the other movie that your recent article is about is Women Talking, which recently won an Academy Award, Best Adapted Screenplay Writing, for Sarah Polley's work adapting a novel by Miriam Toews. And you mentioned the writing a little bit in your article. One thing that stood out to me, you said the opening screen shows the text, "The following is a work of female imagination." I'm curious just if you have thoughts about the writing specifically in this movie and how it contributed to the impact of the film for you.
Yeah. So I haven't read Taves's original novel. After I wrote my review, I try not to read too much sometimes ahead of writing, but I have read more about the novel, and I have a little bit of a sense of some of the ways Sarah Polley was adapting the material or making it her own. Though I think it's a pretty faithful adaptation as well, right, to the main story that Taves is telling. But in both cases, right, in the novel, and then definitely with what Polley is doing with the script, um, the events of the movie are based on real life events that happened in the early 2000s in an old Mennonite colony in Bolivia. And they involve the sort of systematic and persistent rape and abuse of hundreds of women in this Mennonite community who were drugged and raped by some of the men in the colony. And that's a true story, right? That we know through other investigative reporting and court trials, the outlines of that case and its sort of factual outlines. And there are 8 men serving prison sentences for those crimes. But Taves herself, and then Polley taking Taves' material, is telling a sort of fictional story about the women involved in that case. And I think so. I won't really speak to the Taves novel as much, but with the Polley's script, right? Like I loved She Said, and I highly recommend people watch it. But if you have to pick one of the 2 movies, right? If you have a limited movie time, I cannot recommend Women Talking enough. I found it. It's also very slow, actually. It's not very dramatic, even for being about something so intense. Right? There's not much of those of the sort of dark and devastating reality is shown on screen. It really is about women talking with each other. So the dialogue is everything. But Polley is also, the movie is a very strange genre to me. The more I think about it, the more I like it. And also the sort of stranger the movie feels in a good way, right? The more profound and sort of mysterious it feels, because it's very realistic. But Polley, in weaving these, right, you feel with a lot of women in a barn talking, right? That's most of the movie is like in a barn with women talking to each other. Not a lot else is happening. And yet, as the movie goes on, you sort of start to feel like you are inside of a fable, right? That was a word that came to my mind, right? Or a myth, right? Not because the women start to seem unreal or not like real humans. They seem very, very real and very particular. But because what they are talking about and what they are imagining and what they are going to choose together collectively as a group really exceeds what is maybe humanly possible, and right, sort of takes us to a realm of right, of imagining a world, right, of really imagining something outside of the norms of the community they're living in, but also sort of our reality as viewers, right, who might feel very far from old Mennonite sort of colony life, but also what they're imagining far exceeds, right, what we live in, and far exceeds, let's say, even what a movie like She Said could imagine is possible, right, or what the choices or prospects really are. So that word imagination, I think, is really huge, and that Polley is, both through her writing and the choices she makes as a director. She directed the movie as well, right? The way that she films it really push us right into this other way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm excited to see this film as well. So most of the other Oscars this year, it seemed like, were captured by the film Everything Everywhere All at Once, which you also wrote about for the Christian Century last year. And in your article, you talked a lot about the power of choice and the way the movie explores our choice to live this life that we have instead of all the other what ifs that we could imagine. That reminded me a bit, thinking about this week, about what you wrote about women talking and the central choice that kind of drives the plot of the film. These women in this barn deciding together, will we do nothing, will we fight, or will we leave? I'm curious, like, what you think this film could teach us, what the women in this film could teach us about decision making, about making wise choices together.
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned Everything Everywhere All at Once, because actually both of these movies, Women Talking and Everything Everywhere All at Once, were two of my favorite movies of this whole year. And if viewers watching this haven't seen Everything Everywhere, I highly recommend it. It's so different, so different than Women Talking. It also is a wild work of imagination, and really presses us way beyond the confines of our normal lives. And has a very different feel, but it's also just really a fantastic movie with, I think, a lot of things to say and think about. And it's the kind of movie you keep thinking about for a long time after, and it's great to talk about with friends. So I recommend it. I do think, though, I mean, you're right. There is a kind of a sort of central act of choosing that the protagonist or the heroines of each of these movies have to make. I think they're pretty different in that Evelyn Wang in Everything Everywhere All at Once, right, is she's making a choice. Her choice is going to have profound influence or effects for not just her life, but and not just her world, but a whole multiverse of intersecting parallel universes. But it is, in a sense, a choice she has to make, right, about how she understands her own life and her own finitude, and what it is to accept one particular life. Where Women Talking, part of what is so radical about it, and maybe what makes it feel a little bit like a fable, right? What I'm trying to name in that uncertain way to describe it is that these women are discerning, right, a collective decision, right, something they're going to do collectively. All the women in the colony are going to abide by this decision and do it together. But as they discern it, they are just trying to also discern what is the shape of a communal life that would actually live out their theological commitments, right? So they're Mennonites, so they have these profound commitments to nonviolence, to disregard for human laws, and choosing, right, a sort of the way of the Lord, right, that is supposed to model something against the kind of normal secular society. And of course, their own community has been a source of abuse, and spiritual abuse and sexual abuse, and the ways in which theology and spiritual power has been wielded against them. And yet they are still wrestling with, but what would a community really founded on peaceable love look like? And how would we make it? And so there's one of the things that makes the movie so riveting, right, is even though they're just talking, they're telling stories, they are communally trying to discern together, right, what it is that their theology would lead them to, and that it just has a kind of register that really no other movie I've seen in a really long time has, and I think also, right, it's not really possible what they want to do. I think we're not supposed to think, oh, well, they could just go and do that, but that's what makes it that much more sort of fabulous and amazing. So it is, I think, so much about discernment, right, and about what these women can discern together. And I think it matters. None of them can read or write, right? They've had very little formal education, and yet they are incredibly wise, right, in figuring out how to listen to their own intuition and interpret, right, their kind of deepest convictions together.
Wow, yeah. It sounds like you mentioned earlier, despite being so removed from most of our contexts, that it's still something that would resonate, particularly for people maybe in faith communities, this modeling of theological discernment and imagination. And yeah, so I'm, again, very excited to see this film. Thanks so much for sharing about them here and in your article. For anyone who missed the recent article about these two films, or last year's review of Everything Everywhere All at Once, both of those links will be below in the video description. Kathryn, thank you so much for hanging out and chatting today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and if you'd see them, then I'd love to talk about them even more.
Okay, well, we'll do a round two after I have
Okay.
watched these films.